Hi, my name is Ananda Card, and I'm going to be giving you my presentation titled One Family's Experience Discovering and Remediating Their Home and Children from Lead Contamination. Oops. So I'll start by introducing us. On the left is my husband, Dr. Graham Card. He is a structural biologist. He worked in the UK for Cancer Research UK and in the US for biotech research and at the Stanford Linear Accelerator. He did training as a builder for 6 months in Hamilton in 2014, and he's currently a program manager for the Gisborne District Council. I am Ananda Card on your right. I have a degree in molecular biology and I've worked as an analytical chemist. I worked in the US in small biotech companies and Merck and Amgen pharmaceutical companies. I also worked in an analytical lab at Hill Laboratories as a technologist for 4 years. And for the last almost 4 years, I have been a stay-at-home mom. And those are our children. Berkeley is currently 2, Rosemary 11 months, and our son Francis is 5 and just started school today. So I'll go through and just tell you our story, and then I will intersperse it with some facts and information to give some context. So we moved from Hamilton to Gisborne in 2019, 2 years ago, for Graham to start working at the council. And we have all these beautiful lead light windows in our 1929 bungalow that we thought was a beautiful old home. And after realizing these lead light windows seemed a bit, what's the word? Well, they were just really beautiful, and I wondered what would happen if they got broken. And so I was researching how to fix them. And, we have kids, things happen, and realized that they're actually made of lead and that the lines in them are lead. And if you look at our picture of the house, you can see at the front door, this lead light window comes almost right down to the floor. And our son, Berkeley, would play there on a table next to the window, and he would play with our keys or whatever was on the table. And I realized that it was right there, he could touch it. And that started a whole cascade of events that I'll tell you about now. And so when I realized that he could touch lead, and we didn't know if he did or he had, or how dangerous that was or anything, I started researching it, and I found American activist Tamara Rubin, who has a Facebook page and a Facebook group and a website with thousands of different blog posts on it. And I started to learn a lot about lead that's in our everyday environment that is still currently a hazard to kids. And that just opened my eyes to a whole lot, including all the other lead risks that we had in our house that I hadn't seen before. So as I'm starting to freak out, Graham is thinking I'm just being paranoid. So we agreed to send a few samples off to Hill Labs and see what was in them. We sent a couple of vacuum dust samples and some soil. Well, our carpet dust came back at 2100 ppm and our soil was 700. And so then we realized that actually we do have a problem, and that's a really, really lot of lead. So before I go on, I will tell you about some of these lead facts to give you some context. So in New Zealand, the notifiable level for blood is 0.24 micromoles per liter, which by international units is 5 micrograms per deciliter, which is the one I'm going to use because it's just easier than using all those decimals. So I think it's interesting to note that in the United States, that notifiable level comes from population averages, not because anybody has decided that that is a number that is safe for children to get to. It's that everybody has agreed that there's no safe level of lead exposure, and so that, and they're actually proposing to change it down to 3.5 based on the new, well, 5 years ago, population numbers. And then in New Zealand, soil, depending on rural or urban residential, is 160 or 210 ppm is considered contaminated. And then for dust wipes, this is based on the US EPA standards, a floor should be less than 10 micrograms per square foot, and a windowsill should be less than 100 micrograms per square foot to be considered not hazardous. It's also interesting to note that those numbers are not just based on what is safe for kids, but the US EPA trying to keep a certain number of kids below what used to be the previous notifiable level of 10 micrograms per deciliter, and taking that information and countering it with a cost-benefit analysis. So it's not just that below those levels are safe, it's that, one, they were safe, they considered safe, when the notifiable level was 10, and also based on what they think is an appropriate amount of money to spend on this. And then the amount of lead that's allowed in paint is surprisingly 1,000 ppm on most paints, besides the 90 ppm that's allowed on children's toys. In the US, I think all of the paint must be below 90, but for some reason in New Zealand, we still have this 1,000, even though I'm pretty sure most current paints don't have any. So let me go into the low level exposure in children, because even though the notifiable level is 5 micrograms per deciliter, there's a whole lot of research showing that below 5 micrograms per deciliter, there is increased, or the kids have decreased IQ, they have behavioral problems and impulsivity, and increased risk for ADHD, speech delay, and trouble with reading and maths in school. And a lot of those things are delayed effects from lead exposure that happens when they're babies. So a 10-month-old might be exposed to lead and seems totally fine until they start school and they're having trouble reading and doing math. And people often say, well, I was exposed to lead and I'm fine. But actually, you can't tell these things on a personal level. It's when you look at populations with thousands of people and you start to analyze the risks when on a huge population level, that's when you see that these things are happening. And so it's really important to take that into account. And as time goes on and the levels of the populations decrease and the instrumentation gets better on testing low levels of lead in blood, then we start to notice these things a lot better, and there's more research on the lower levels. So back to our story. So we realized that our carpet dust was really high and our soil was also contaminated. And at the time we had these two boys, Francis, 3.5 years old, and Berkeley was 9 months at the time we moved here. So I started looking around. I went back and found some photos of Berkeley playing in the backyard, and this just kills me. I mean, how naive was I taking pictures of my 9-month-old eating dirt? Like, hello. I was one of those moms who thought they're outside, it's fine, the dirt is good for you, let them get dirty, just play, 1,000 hours outside. And now I look back on this and it's just tragic. So once we realized we had a problem, we decided to get the kids tested, but it's actually really difficult to do. So it took me 2 weeks to get them tested, and I had several calls to the doctor's office. First, I talked to the nurse, who had no idea what I was talking about and did not think it was a valid thing. And she went and talked to the doctor, who came back and said, nope, there's no way the kids have any lead in them unless you've just painted your house. Have you painted your house? And I said, no, and they said, well, no. So finally, I got a different doctor. I gave them some facts and managed to finally get the kids tested after 2 weeks. Doesn't help that our doctor's office is also pretty booked up. But looking around, these are the things we started to see in the house. So we had this bay window with a whole bunch of small LED lights in it. And then we have along the side of the house, we had 3 really large LED light windows. That's in our lounge. Our front porch had lots of chipping paint, which turned out the chipping paint is modern paint. So that green paint is actually fine. But when we tested the wood underneath it, that was really high. Um, Actually, we didn't test it with XRF. I tested it with a lead check swab, and it was pretty bright red. So I think at one point that porch had lead paint on it, and it was now impermeated into the wood. So surprisingly, most people don't know this, but all of that native timber that you see in that picture, the door frame, the trim, the door, the ceilings, every single part of that wood did also have lead in it. Not huge amounts, but it was positive with a lead check swab, so it's over 600 ppm. We had a couple of these doors like this that were rubbing on the door frame all the way down to the wood, exposing lead paint underneath, even though the top coat was fine. So every time we open and close that door, it would screech, and tiny, tiny amounts of lead dust would fall down. Here's another picture of our beautiful lead light windows. And here is a picture of a window we have a new addition to the house in the back that was built in 2008. And they used windows apparently from the 50s or 60s that were lead painted. So even though that part of the house was new, the windows were not, and that had lead. Finally got the kids' blood levels back. Francis was 1 microgram per deciliter, which is approximately the average in the United States. And Berkeley was 4.8. And remember, the notifiable level is 5. So he was just a hair under the notifiable level. But it did take us 2 weeks to order that test from the time we realized we needed to. So I'm sure it would have been above before, but it doesn't matter. So moving on, we realized we definitely have a big problem in our house. Our baby has lead in his blood. There's hazards everywhere. What do we do about this? I tried talking to our GP. I tried calling public health. No, nothing helpful there. The Ministry of Health website was not helpful. I searched and searched and searched for any New Zealand references to cleaning up lead in homes. Nope. Lead abatement companies in New Zealand. Anybody at all who specialized in lead paint removal or cleaning houses? Nope. Any New Zealand lead risk assessors? Surely there must be one. No. Finally, I found one person who had a presentation on lead in homes in New Zealand and had an XRF for testing. So, amazing. And then the things that we did find helpful was this Australian document, the 6-step guide to painting your home, that had lots of really helpful information in it. There is a New Zealand equivalent of that document, which is not helpful at all. Tamara Rubin's website and Facebook group were an amazing trove of information, really, really knowledgeable and helpful and science-based. That was one of the biggest sources of our education. And then the US EPA dust wipe standards and the lead group in Australia website was also helpful. So we did lots of research. We began testing everything in the house that we could, mainly with lead check swabs to begin with. We took 2 weeks to make a plan on what we were going to do. Every day of that time, I was thinking, oh my God, our babies are being poisoned in this house and we are still here. But we had nowhere to go. We had to figure out what we were doing. I looked at Airbnbs to help us get out of the house. And they were all filled with lead too. I looked at one that said it had been fully renovated, and I went and looked, and the windows had flaking paint and were original. So with no other choice, I took the boys and moved into our motorhome. First, we went to the holiday park for a week, I think, and then realized that if we were at home, I could help Graham. So we came back and stayed in the camper van for a month, and Graham started renovating like crazy. There's Graham at the top doing some clearance testing. And there's a picture also of our lead check swabs. So you can take one swab and squeeze out the liquid and use little cotton swabs to test a whole bunch of things, up to 6 per swab. So we've tested probably hundreds of these things. And so through all of our journey, these are the results that we found. So the soil and dust samples we sent to Hill Labs for ICP-MS analysis. Our veggie box was 290 ppm, and our highest level of those samples was 2,500 ppm, which is right off of our back deck. And our dust samples were 133 ppm in the carpet that was in the new edition. And then the carpet that was under our lead light windows. So I took a vacuum and took the head off of it and just vacuumed over and over and over and over again, all within a meter of all of our lead light windows. And that's the dust from the vacuum that was 2,100 ppm. So then we found Mr. Ben Keat, the environmental auditor who cares about lead. And he came to our house 3 different times and tested over 120 different items. He tested like so many surfaces of our house, which was absolutely illuminating. We found some really surprising things, like in the back of our house, there's this whole entrance area near the back door that used to be exterior, but has since been closed in with boards and jib. And so all of the ceiling back there, like slatted ceiling, is 90,000 or 100,000 ppm. And then we had a bunch of, from that area, there was a small hallway which led into our kitchen and living room. And the door frames around the kitchen and living room were both 90,000 ppm. And they looked just like every other door frame in our house. Like we would have had no idea that they were so high if it hadn't been for the XRF testing. And then he also tested a bunch of our soil, and the soil in the front of the house under the bay windows was 3,500 ppm. That was our highest one. Even though Hill Labs does do some dust wipe analysis, they were pretty expensive, and as luck would have it, it made sense to send a kit and dust wipe samples all the way across the Pacific Ocean to the United States to be analyzed there, which sounds crazy, but it was cheaper. So we had tests done at a lab there via AAS analysis, flame absorption spectroscopy. We had 5 wipes analyzed there of all of our dust, and our bedroom dresser was non-detect. There was no lead in that one, but underneath our lead light window, our big lead light window in the lounge, that was 468 micrograms per square foot. And keep in mind, the US EPA hazard is 100 for windowsills. So ours was 468, so almost 5 times higher than the EPA hazard level. And for floors, it's only 10. But this is a windowsill, so we'll use those standards. And then the SKC full disclosure wipes is another really super useful thing that we got via secret method, because in New Zealand you can order them, but only if you spend $500 in ordering from VWR. And I didn't need $500 worth of wipe test kits, so I had them shipped to me. But that's a secret. Don't tell them. That is a potassium rhodizonate kit where you can see what Graham is doing in the top picture. You take a ghost wipe and you wipe a specific area, and then it has 2 different sprays, an acid as well as the potassium rhodizonate. And if there's lead on the wipe, it will turn red. If there's 18 micrograms of lead on the wipe, it will turn red. So that was really useful for us. You get 10 wipes in a kit. And every time we used it, we found lead in places that we did not expect it to be. So I will tell you about that later. So that first month, can you imagine this huge list of things that Graham was able to do? He removed our carpets, and while removing the carpets, keeping them wet, putting them in bags, putting it straight into a skip to keep the lead dust down, mopping the floors like hundreds of thousands of times. He thinks he probably mopped like a couple of square kilometers of floor in there because we did so many times. He replaced that front porch, removed a few of the big lead lights. We just replaced those with plain windows. The lead lights that are in the bay windows, he made glass frames for them to completely encapsulate each one. All the skirting boards and trim that have the native timber, he polyurethaned several coats of that. Interestingly enough, if you look at the second picture here, these floorboards, which were under our carpet right near our bathroom, that is lead paint, just right on top, probably coming through the carpet. We don't. I think it was repaired at some point, so lead paint straight on the floorboards. So those we removed completely and replaced. Um, we had a hearth, a concrete hearth where there used to be a fireplace with the top of it was red. That was lead paint that was mixed into the concrete. He had to demolish that whole thing into underneath the floor. We had the rubbing door frames, which were fixed and painted. We had a bunch of windows that needed to be stripped and repainted. Some of them we sealed shut because we didn't want to deal with any kind of lead dust coming through them. And the front door, the threshold had to be repainted, and some of the door had to be stripped. And then our kitchen window was this big, huge, multi-paned thing with flaking paint coming off it right above our kitchen bench. We just put a 3M window seal on that to just seal it all in. And so after all this, we did clearance testing with the SKC wipes. And interestingly enough, you look at this picture of our front door, that wood floor right in front of it, that tested positive. So we mopped and mopped and mopped it, tested again, still positive. So what we had to do is I got on my hands and knees with concentrated sugar soap and a, a thick brush and just like Cinderella, scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing. And you could see just kind of like mud just coming up out of the wood. And then using the three bucket mop system to get rid of all of that nastiness that was in the wood. And then finally, the next day, it tested clear. So I think that front porch had lead paint on it, and over, I don't know, 100 years ago or 90 years ago, people walking over and over and over onto this wood floor, the lead just got embedded into the wood. And so we were pulling out 90 years of grime in that wood that had contaminated it. And then here's a picture of all of our belongings that Graham had to move several times into different parts of the house, keeping them covered in plastic and taped down to keep them uncontaminated. In the meantime, while I'm living in the camper van, taking care of the boys, we're under immense stress, and Graham is working like crazy. I find out I'm pregnant. How convenient is that? uh, so yes, trying to scrub the floor, knowing I'm pregnant, also knowing that I shouldn't be helping with any kind of lead work because I don't want to expose myself was just another layer of craziness on top of all of this. So on with the renovations, within the next 6 months after that, we had the floors refinished. We had to replace the exterior water cabinet that had flaking lead paint on the top of it. We had to remove 20 to 30 centimeters of that highly contaminated soil, including that 3,500 ppm soil that was under our windows in the front. All while pregnant and trying to manage living in a completely leaded construction zone, trying to protect the new baby. The following year after that, we renovated the kitchen, which included removing walls and an adjacent toilet. We replaced 3 large windows. with double glazed PVC windows and 2 ranch sliders. Graham has reclad the entire northeast side of the house with insulation, and then had to repaint the entire exterior of the house. So much work. And those 2 door frames that were 90,000 or 80,000 ppm lead, those we just removed completely to get rid of that risk. And then that really high lead ceiling in the back that used to be exterior, we've jibbed over just to keep anything from falling down and keep the surface smooth. And then our baby girl was born. There's baby Rosemary. So here's some fun facts about lead. These are all the things that you may not know still have lead in them today. They are manufactured with it, or they come with lead in it, and that's just the way it is. So ceramics like this San Francisco cup that our friends gave us when they came back from the US, 1800 ppm lead with, I think it was 450 ppm cadmium as well, and some arsenic. And the interesting to note that the red in ceramics is often has cadmium in it, and the inside of that mug has a red heart in the middle, which is not as bright red as it used to be, as Graham has been using it for his hot chocolate. So how much cadmium has he consumed from that? Pressure cookers. Ben tested my pressure cooker, which had 20,000 ppm lead in the valve nut at the top and 30,000 ppm mercury. That's great, isn't it? Which is a common occurrence with pressure cookers, according to Tamara Rubin. Brass has lead, so doorknobs, keys, hoses, and also the brass in tapware, which is where a lot of lead comes from in drinking water in our houses. Tile in bathtubs, because they're ceramic, often have, some can have significant amounts of lead, like hundreds of thousands ppm. So any toys from before 2010 can have higher amounts of lead, especially vintage toys. But even generic toys from the $2 shop, especially things, it could be plastic, but especially things that are painted or jeweled, like this Disney bracelet in the picture at the bottom, that I believe was 200,000 ppm lead in there, in those jewels. So toys, yeah, could be a big problem. There's lots of figurines that look really cute and beautiful, but are not actually manufactured as toys. Those often have high amounts of lead or can have lead paint on them. Bullets and fishing weights obviously have a huge amount, but some people don't think about that. Fuels for light aircraft and racing cars has lead in it still. Vitamins and supplements, because they come from food and the processing, often have lead in them. Any kind of painted glassware, like if you look at this measuring cup right here, any of those Pyrex or Anchor measuring cups, you test that with a lead check swab, that's going to be positive. I had a few other glasses, some pint glasses, and that was all positive. That's all lead. Galvanized steel is contaminated with, the zinc is contaminated with lead, so galvanized steel can have lead in it, as well as vinyl and PVC, like these cute My Little Pony vinyl stickers. Those have lead in them. Not always, but some do. Pewter, and then baby food. That's been a big thing in the US recently. Congress is taking action because of the high amounts of lead that's been found in baby food. So these are our blood levels. You can tell this orange bar, that's Berkeley. He was the youngest baby, so his were the highest. He started just below 5 and then started dropping down once we took him away from the source. Francis, he was 3.5 at the time, wasn't putting everything in his mouth, was better at not sucking on things and all of that. So his level started out pretty low. I'm the green line. Mine was pretty low. The second point for me is when I was 8 months pregnant. That was a relief to know that I hadn't been exposed through the renovations or had lead mobilized from my bones during the pregnancy, which also can happen if I'd been exposed as a kid. And then you see the purple line. Poor Graham, his level is going up because of all these renovations he's been doing. So that's despite taking all precautions and tons of hand washing and face masks and disposable clothes and respirators, and still it's below 2, so it's not a massive amount, but it's there. And then we have the little yellow dot here, baby rosemary. We had tested about a month and a half ago, and she is 1.7. So we're not sure what to think about that, if that's high or not. I mean, it's below 5, so people say, oh, it's not that big of a deal. And it's below 3, which is also kind of another threshold. But then you think, well, it's 1.7 then. Could it have been 3 a month ago? Because the half-life in blood is 30 to 45 days, or it's supposed to be. It's not always like that because Berkeley's, we noticed, was closer to 90 days. It took about 90 days to go from close to 5 to almost 2.5. And then, yeah, so maybe he's just not as good at detoxing as others. I don't know. I think these things are pretty individual. So after all that work on the house, we still have a contaminated soil problem. So here's a shot of our house from Google Maps. This is our deck here, the white part, and this is all the places we've had tested. So at the front, under the bay windows, that was 3,500. Off the deck, 2,500. Around the house here was 700, and lots of things between 200 and 500. Back here, 600 something, whereas the rest of it's around like the 3, 4, 500 range. Really disheartening to realize that the entire yard was contaminated, except for the front. The front's pretty good, so the boys are still allowed to play in the front. So these green areas are the places where we've taken the soil out, and we are really wary of bringing any new soil in because unless we can test it first, we do not have any faith that it's not going to be contaminated. Living in a place like this where all of our neighbors all have 100-year-old houses with flaking lead paint on their fences, and all of that's going into the mulch, which is going into the soil. So yeah, who knows? But right now we've covered it with weed mat and mulch, and it's protected for now. We have gotten some quotes, talked to a whole bunch of land movers and landscapers, and that area, the grassy area, to get that done was supposed to be in the range of $25,000, which is a lot of money. And yeah, so we haven't done that. For now, there's baby Rosemary looking from her cot into the backyard. She is not allowed to go outside. Once she starts walking and she's not putting everything in her mouth, then under intense supervision, she will be allowed out. But for now, she can just look. So I want to talk about the lead light windows because this is something that it seems that nobody knows about. So even when you search for this online, there's hardly any sources about it, and it's really confounding. So I'll go through a little bit about the windows. So the cames, they're called, the lead cames holding the glass together, that is almost 100% lead. And it's constantly oxidizing and dusting tiny microscopic amounts of lead down into the floor below it or the windowsill. And people think like, oh, well, that's elemental lead. It's not that bioavailable, which is commonly thought, but that is not true. It can be up to 100% absorbed. Carpet, I have some sources for that. Carpet under any lead light windows will just trap the lead, and you vacuum it and it is not going to come out. You'd have to do some really serious vacuuming to get all the dust out, like I said, but carpet is notoriously bad for just absorbing lead and not being able to be cleaned. And then you have a crawling baby who's crawling on the carpet and knocking all that dust up into the air. And so even though ingested lead may only be up to 50% in kids, inhaled lead can be 100% absorbed. So lead inhaled is a huge risk to kids. And all the lead risk assessors overseas who do dust wipe analysis all realize that lead lights or stained glass is a big risk, but for some reason, it's just people don't know about it. Um, so our dust, I'll remind you, was 400 micrograms per square foot underneath um, the small windows and 470 underneath the big window. And that's taking into consideration, or you should take into consideration that Graham had just cleaned all of that and painted it a couple months prior to being analyzed. So it's not like that's years of dust. That has only been there for a couple months and it was fresh paint under it. So that's a lot. That's almost 5 times the EPA hazard level. So where are we at now? After all this 2 years of ongoing efforts, our soil is still contaminated. And there's always that thing of we don't know what we don't know. We have not done dust wipe analyses of every single square foot of our house. We don't know if there's places that there is lead that Ben hasn't tested, and maybe that is what is making Rosemary's blood be 1.7. We just don't know what we don't know. So we are constantly vigilant. We have to just be really vigilant. So last week we had solar panels installed, and the electrician from Solar City came and needed to put a big hole in the wall. So the only place he could put it was that back section where we have those exterior weatherboards behind the walls that have really, really high 1929 original lead paint on the surface. And so when we moved into the house, that's covered in some kind of wood board here, you can see. And we've jibbed over it. But still, you cut through all those layers, and cutting through that is going to be making lead dust that will come through onto the floor. So when we found that out, Graham had to put up containment everywhere on the walls and the windows and the floor, and tape things to the floor and the wall, and just completely contain it as much as possible, because that tradie, that electrician, when he leaves for the day, you know what they're like when they leave bits of everything mess everywhere. And then Rosemary comes crawling along and is right there. So it's a huge amount of work for us, and we will have to it'll be this way forever. Constant vigilance. So I just wanted to do a quick comparison of the difference in the situation between the US and New Zealand. So for doctors in America, kids routinely go to their doctor's offices and they get a finger prick with instant results of their blood lead levels. That's done routinely for all kids on government assistance, as well as any kids who meet criteria in a questionnaire, if they live in an old house, if they've been doing renovations, et cetera, et cetera. That's a routine thing. Almost all kids are checked that way in America, and some states are better than others. But in New Zealand, it's really difficult to get any GP to order a blood test. You have to justify it. You have to get somebody who even knows that is a risk, who understands, and some GPs I've heard will say that it's not a funded test, so you can't order it at all. So it's really, really difficult, and most of the GPs don't know very much at all, if anything, about lead. And then the builders in the US, the tradesmen must be certified in working safely with lead paint under the EPA's renovation and repair certification program. And anybody caught not or working on anything leaded without the certification has really high fines. I think they could be probably better with their following up on that, but still, at least it's a rule. Here in New Zealand, nobody knows. Nobody knows. We found out really fast that we were going to have to do all of this work ourselves if we wanted to do things safely. Because when you're sanding lead paint or stripping lead paint or putting a hole in the wall or doing anything, just a teeny, 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 tiny amount of lead dust is enough to poison a kid. Apparently, there are some guidelines about how to contain lead when working on houses. I have found these since then, but it doesn't seem like anybody knows about them. It seems completely voluntary and is toothless. In the US, for assistance, if you find lead in your house, there is federal and local grants to help homeowners with abatement. Sometimes huge amounts, like thousands and thousands, dozens of thousands of dollars they'll give people to sort their homes out, especially if there's renters with kids in the house. There's nothing like that in New Zealand at all. Most of New Zealand does not really even know that we have a lead problem. For notification in the US, if you buy a house or you rent a house that could have lead paint, you're required to receive a notification. I'm not sure if it's like that in every single state, but a lot are. So that at least when you go in, you're aware that it could be a problem, even if you might not take it seriously, you've been notified. That's not the case in New Zealand. And lastly, about observation, there's ongoing population studies in the US, whereas in New Zealand, nobody's ever even looked at kids less than 5 years old. It's never been done. Nobody's looking at them. So we don't even know what the averages are. So I have created a Facebook page to try to educate people. Lead Awareness NZ. You can check me out on Facebook. So I'm trying to protect kids. I know that if we found this in our house, there's so many other families that have kids that are being exposed that have no idea. And maybe people don't care, or maybe they just don't know, but I'm sure people, if they found out that they had lead risks in their house and their baby could be brain damaged from that lead, because it's an irreversible lifelong damage, that they would want to know about it and try to protect their kids if they could. So I'm trying to do that education, trying the best I can. I have 314 followers right now. Come along and join me. And I'm a scientist, so I am all about researching and having science-based information. I may not get it 100% right every single time, but I'm willing to be corrected. And I'm always interested in anyone who wants to do any collaborating or connecting with me, because this is a passion of mine now. These are the goals that I have for Lead Awareness NZ. Number 1, test the kids. There's routine immunizations at 1 year and 4 years, and kids could be tested with a blood finger prick there in all the GP offices, just like they do in America. I don't see any reason why that couldn't happen here. Number 2, we should regulate lead like asbestos is regulated. The cleanup for asbestos and lead are almost exactly the same. So if you can clean up asbestos, you can clean up lead, and we can protect kids from both asbestos and lead in the same regulation. You just add lead onto it. You could have required training for people who work with it. You could have clearance testing, and that would protect tenants. Because if somebody's renting a house and their landlord comes in and hires some guy to replace a window, and he sands that paint down and it gets all in the carpet and everywhere, and doesn't clean up, leaves for the day, doesn't care, and that kid could be poisoned. So our kids in the rentals are very vulnerable. Number 3, safe school and ECE standards. There's a lot of toys and contaminated soil and old painted houses in ECEs. I'm not sure exactly about the schools, but they should at least be checking their water for lead in the water and other things, toys and things that they play with. Number 4, free vacuum dust testing for families. It'd be great if every council or every plunket had a service where somebody could just bring some vacuum dust down there in a plastic bag and find out how high their lead is. If they find out it's a couple hundred ppm, then they realize that they have a problem in their house. If it's 10 ppm, yay, it's fine. They can move on. That would be really easy screening. Number 5, reports on the enforcement of the Unsafe Goods Act. So that is the act that says that toys can't be any more than 90 ppm lead. But is anybody actually checking that? I don't know. I would really like to know that. Because just because it's a rule doesn't mean it's actually enforced. So it would be great if we could have reports on containers that were turned away, or recalls on toys that were found to have lead paint. All those things is really important. And number 6, new one after the situation in Otago a couple months ago. Yeah, we really need to be monitoring lead in drinking water, obviously. So I want to thank ALGA for hosting me, and Ben Keat for all his help and shared knowledge. He's been such an amazing help for us testing our house. Um, the Wasteman's Lead Working Group for all their efforts. Elizabeth O'Brien and the Lead Group in Australia and worldwide. Tamara Rubin for all her help and information. And everyone else working to protect kids and wildlife from lead poisoning. And lastly, but not least, my superhuman husband who has done all this work for 2 years now. He really needs a holiday. And lastly, here's some references for some of the things that I've posted in case anybody wants to follow up or correct me on them. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for having me, and I'll be there for the Q&A. Cheers.